I want to show you one of the most beautiful, interesting and controversial places in Berlin. The bombastic, over-the-top Soviet War Memorial in Treptower Park. Let's do it. It's the final resting place of 7,000 Soviet soldiers, although I have read it might be up to 9,000. It would seem nobody is exactly sure. And yeah, it's a place of great meaning for, of course, the Soviet Union, for Germany, but also for East Germany. So what I want to do with this video is not just show you the memorial and see how beautiful it is and see the kind of great Soviet design from the 1940s. What I want to do is talk about how this memorial was used to shape a historical narrative in the newly founded nation of East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic. In fact, this memorial is older than East Germany was. It was opened on the 8th of May, 1949, 4 years to the date that Germany surrendered at the end of World War II, about a couple of weeks before West Germany was founded, and a few months before East Germany would be founded on the 7th of October of the same year. So how did we get to the point where thousands of Soviet soldiers are being buried here in Berlin? Well, we have to look at the last days of World War II, 1945. And to put it in a little bit of context, the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany in the summer of 1941, the 22nd of June, a surprise attack called Operation Barbarossa. The Soviets were fought all the way back to Moscow. There's the siege of Stalingrad. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians are killed. During this time, Stalin is begging Churchill, begging Roosevelt to open up a second front to basically divide German forces. And that takes a long time. D-Day is the middle of 1944. Of course, it's a huge success, an unprecedented success, and eventually by the end of the year, Western allies will start to enter Germany. The Soviets, on the other hand, start to enter Germany in January of 1945 when they invade East Prussia, Pomerania and Brandenburg, and actually they managed to sweep through German territory very, very quickly. They cross the Vistula, it's the Vistula offensive, and then they sweep right through to the next line, which is the Oder-Neisse line, named for the Oder and Neisse rivers. Now that line, the nearest point to Berlin where the Oder River is only 100 kilometers away. If you were to hop in a car right here and drive there just now, it would take you a little over 1 hour. This is close, and it's on that line that the Soviets sit for a couple of months while they shore up their supply lines. They send in men, of course, guns, food, medical supplies, everything that they're going to need to attack the last remaining part of Germany, the fascist capital. Kill the fascists in their lair, as the Soviet propaganda would say. And this is no small attack. The Soviets actually eventually conjure up 2.5 million soldiers, and they begin the offensive in the middle of April of that year. Now there are 3 Soviet field marshals who are controlling 3 fronts. Rokossovsky is going to take the area north of Berlin with about 500,000 soldiers. Zhukov is going to come in right from the east, and then Konyev is going to secure the southern side. It's actually Zhukov's job to take Berlin, but he's got a big obstacle. Not just the Oder River. They do start to cross that on the 16th of April, but this begins with the Battle of Seelow Heights, and one day I would love to make a video just about this. It's supposedly the largest collection of artillery ever in history, both this front and Konyev's front. It takes longer than the Soviets expect. In fact, the Battle of Seelow Heights will last for 4 days. It's an absolutely massive thing. Apparently, the Soviets used so much artillery that the boom at dawn on the 16th of April, when the guns opened fire, was so loud that it could be heard from the eastern edges of Berlin. The Soviet soldiers there had to unbuckle their helmets and scream so as to equalize the pressure, and even then many of them were left bleeding from the ears. And those soldiers that were by the guns were probably the lucky ones, because some of them were just sent out onto this open plain to essentially soak up German fire and work as human minesweepers. This was to make way for the tanks. Now eventually Zhukov's forces would take the Reichsstraße 1, this great big road that would allow them to bring guns, men, everything they need into Berlin. But the delay had caused a couple of problems, a big problem for Zhukov as well. Stalin was, of course, incredibly angry and incredibly paranoid that the Americans would swoop in and break the deal and take Berlin and get a hold of, well, a lot of nuclear weapons, science and scientists that he really wanted. And so, to make sure that his men were successful, he lit something of a fire under their asses. Field Marshal Konyev and Field Marshal Zhukov were told, one of you is going to get to Berlin, one of you is going to take the Reichstag, and one of you is going to go down in history as the hero who defeated Hitler, Nazism, fascism, and save the Soviet Union. And one of you is going to be the other guy. Zhukov's forces would eventually reach the edge of Berlin by the 20th of April. They would start shelling the very edges of the city. That was, of course, Adolf Hitler's birthday. Not that necessarily they knew that, but, you know, quite poignant, no? Eventually, of course, these two fronts with their combined 2 million soldiers will start to surround and attack Berlin and fight street to street. And, you know, who's left on the German side? The Germans don't have like this secret army that they've just been waiting to unleash to save the capital, although you might think it from the propaganda, from promises of a wonder weapon. And also when we talk of the propaganda, the Soviet soldiers who are coming in, according to the Nazis, are these subhuman Asiatic hordes who are going to destroy everything about this country. So it's fight to the death, because otherwise, you know, the Nazis were presenting this as an existential threat. I'm not saying everyone bought into that, but the fear that the Berliners must have felt would have been very real. Zhukov's forces don't enter just after opening fire because there's one more air raid that's going to hit the city. On the 21st of April 1945, the Americans send 732 bombers for a last attack on Berlin, and it's when the dust clears from that air raid that the Soviets do start to enter. Now, yeah, who's left on the German side? You have the remnants of the Waffen-SS, elite, highly trained, and of course their SS, highly motivated men, soldiers, whose job it is to motivate everybody else as well. If you were just a regular dude in Berlin at this time and you said, hey, I think we're going to lose, you would end up dead. That is the crime of defeatism, a crime against the German people. They would execute people in the street, hang them from lampposts. It's not just the Waffen-SS who are fighting. I mean, there's very, very few fighting-age men. There's quite a lot of old men that have been drafted into the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, some of them putting on old World War I uniforms, carrying old rifles. And of course, the really tragic thing is that there's lots of young boys, lots of members of the Hitler Youth who could be as young as 10, whose job it is, you know, to blow the tracks off of Soviet T-34 tanks and to, well, literally stop them in their tracks. The Battle of Berlin sees tens of thousands of deaths. I've read up to 180,000, with deaths being split roughly 50-50 between the Soviets and the Germans, although of course there are very many civilian deaths on the German side. It was on the 2nd of May 1945 that the Berlin garrison surrendered and brought the Battle of Berlin to an end. There would be little pockets of werewolf actions over the next few days, but actually Germany as a whole would then surrender on the 8th of May at an officer training school that had become Soviet military headquarters out in the east of Berlin. There's a fantastic museum there if you want to check it out. And of course, Zhukov is the one who signs the papers for the Soviets, and there's representation, of course, of the Americans and Brits as well. It's in a ceremony there that World War II in Europe is brought to an end, and then we can start to count the figures. Of course, the war would end with the surrender of Japan a few months later, and with that included, with the Pacific War included, historians reckon that there's between 60 and 65 million people who are killed in the Second World War, and 27 million of those are Soviet citizens, be they military or civilian. It's an unimaginable amount of loss. Their country was attacked, villages were destroyed, burned to the ground, many civilians were brutally attacked, particularly by the SS, but not exclusively. And it's after this happens, when the Soviets start to enter German territory, some of them looking at a country that's frankly much wealthier, much more developed than the Soviet Union, that they think, well, why did this happen to us? And of course, we can't underestimate the propaganda on their side as well. They're doing everything for communism, for peace, but for Stalin. And there was a culture of taking revenge on the German people under the Red Army. This would mean, in many cases, stealing people's belongings. Soviet soldiers, particularly in Berlin, were fascinated by watches, but all across the eastern parts of Germany, people stole those watches, jewelry, radios, anything of value like this. Of course, many of you watching this know what this revenge really amounted to, particularly for women, including elderly women and young girls who were brutally attacked by Soviet soldiers. I can't actually use the R word, the name of this crime, on YouTube, I believe, but yeah, the thinking is that there's up to 2 million women were victims of this crime. Just incredibly brutal stuff. And of course, if you're one of those women in particular, swapping Hitler for Stalin might be a sideways move, let's say. With that in mind, let's rewind a little bit to the 30th of April, to really one of the final days of the Battle of Berlin. This is where a lot of important things happen. It is, of course, most famously the day that Adolf Hitler decides to take his own life, as Soviet soldiers are, at this point, less than a kilometer away. And they've had a big task, which was getting into what the Germans called Sector Z, Z for Citadella, or Citadel, Fortress. This was the very center of Berlin, which could technically be an island when you look at not just the Spree River, but also the Landwehr Canal. Now, the Germans had prepared for this. The so-called Nero order had been given in the months before, where Hitler had said that anything that could be useful to the Allies must be destroyed so that they can't use it against us. And in Berlin, that meant destroying vantage points quite often, but also bridges. Every bridge in the city was wired to blow up by the SS. But they did a bit of a rush job. It wasn't exactly the most effective. In fact, many bridges did survive. They might have to be demolished after and fixed up and made new, but for the time pressure that is a battle, they were okay. And there was a soldier named Nikolai Masalov. He and his unit on the 30th of April were crossing northwards across the Potsdamer Brücke, close to Potsdamer Platz. And it's here where a really important and dramatic scene unfolded. You have to imagine you've got the Soviets on one side of the bridge, the Germans on the other. The Germans have a heavy machine gun placed there. And of course, they're going to open fire, but as the two sides are preparing to attack one another, while they're still shooting at each other, I would imagine, there's a young girl runs onto this bridge, and Nikolai Masalov, this Soviet soldier, he crawls between the lines, picks her up, and carries her to safety. Now, some people say that this might not be a true story because it's just, such a perfect story, really, for the Soviet Union. There's no reason why it wouldn't be true. I mean, there are eyewitness accounts. People said it did happen. The little girl never did grow up and tell her story, I suppose. When I say she never did grow up, I don't know if she died, by the way. I'm just saying we don't actually have that living, breathing person with their testimony. As you can maybe tell, I choose to believe it. And it's an image that the Soviets would use quite often after World War II, because it presents the Soviet Union not as conquerors, not as the evil servants of Stalin. It presents them really as heroes, as saviors, as liberators, as protectors. That German girl and her generation, they're not going to grow up with Hitler and Stalin and war. They're going to grow up with the peace, safety, security, and equality brought to them by communism and the Soviet Union. The other thing that happens on the 30th of April that's hugely important for what happens next is that there's a group of German communists flown into Berlin from the Soviet Union. Group Ulbricht, named after Walter Ulbricht, and they have strict orders from Stalin. It's Walter Ulbricht and his team, it's their job to found socialism in Germany and make it look democratic. Walter Ulbricht will go on to be essentially the first leader of East Germany. And with the dramatic events of the 30th of April in mind, let's take a look at the memorial itself and how it works. You enter through these huge stone gates that say, eternal glory to the heroes who fell in World War II. At the end of that first tree-lined path is a statue. It's a weeping mother to represent the motherland, Mother Russia, if you will. Her head is bowed down, but if she were to look up, she would see another tree-lined path. The trees there are weeping birch trees. Birch trees are closely associated with Russian culture and folklore and so on. This path perfectly frames the great big statue at the end here, which is a statue of Nikolai Masalov, but we'll get to that in a second, because at the end of that next tree-lined path, you've got these two great big red polished granite structures. I wouldn't really know what to call them. They make a kind of gateway. They're adorned with hammers and sickles, and at the bottom of them, of course, you've got the Soviet soldiers guarding this central area that's behind me as I sit here. And from the peak of that tree-lined path, you can see not just how big this area is, but that it's lined on either side with, in total, 16 sarcophagi that have gold text on them with quotes from Joseph Stalin telling, in a very simple, matter-of-fact way, the story of World War II. I often call it a kind of picture book style because you've got these great images, these reliefs on the side, but this is just designed to give you the most basic idea. It's not all about the details, and it's World War II from just the Soviet perspective, right? From the invasion of the Soviet Union, June 1941, to the people rising up. You see the villagers, the peasants. There's this rather tough-looking woman with her gun that I always like to point out if I'm ever here with friends. And yeah, it brings us to the end, to the defeat of Germany here in Berlin. And then, of course, once you walk past all of those and you head up the stairs, you get right up to the statue of Nikolai Masalov, which is filled with deep meaning and what I like to call Soviet subtlety. Masalov is standing there holding a great big sword. He's stamping on a crushed swastika, and of course there he is carrying that German child to their safe future as well. It's a very, very powerful piece, let's say. And once you are up at the top, you can also look inside and see this mosaic, see again the kind of goddess representing the motherland in there, another image of a child, the Soviet soldiers. It's a very well made and very pretty place, and of course must have been incredibly expensive at a time that was certainly not a time of plenty when you look at the destruction of Germany and the Soviet Union and simply just the lack of people, money, everything that was here. There are, of course, rumours here about different parts of it being made of the ruins of Hitler's Reich chancellery. None of the red stuff, from what I can tell, comes from there. I did read that some of the granite beneath the sarcophagi comes from there. Again, there's so many things that claim to be made of the pieces of Hitler's Reich chancellery that I just don't know what to believe. This seems like a worthy candidate, but yeah, I always take that kind of stuff with a grain of salt. And so what is the point of all this? Why am I telling you this? What is this all really about, right? I mean, cool, story of the war, very interesting looking memorial, great place to visit. You know, I am a tour guide. I like to bring people to places, recommend people places. But really, the point of this place for me is also looking at how the story was told after the war. I talked already about how so many women, civilians, were attacked by the Soviets, how many Germans would not have felt like the Soviets were saviors at all. And we can see this basically because we can see how many Germans started to flee from the east to the west during the war to rather be occupied or liberated by the Brits and Americans than by the Soviets. Part of that is, of course, Nazi propaganda, right? The idea that there are subhuman savages, this horde that's coming to attack. Some people would have bought into that. Some people would have believed in that racism. Some people would have believed what they'd been told by friends and family in places like Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, that, you know, the Soviets have swept in and everything is gone, and, you know, your aunt, for example, has been attacked in this incredibly brutal way. The fact is that none of this is black and white, right? There were Soviet soldiers who were disgusted by the actions of their colleagues and wrote as much in their diaries. It's a very, very difficult topic. For East Germany, though, the Soviets were the heroes. That was the official line from the government. And so let's dig down into that a little bit, right? That's the narrative that East Germany creates. I mean, they had a banger of a national anthem that talked about rising from the ashes. East Germany was founded by technically members of the former communist and socialist parties who had been merged to form the Social Democrats, but that wasn't a free merger. In fact, many of the Social Democrats who had opposed that found themselves in Soviet custody in places called special camps. In a couple of instances at Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, those were former Nazi concentration camps. Sachsenhausen, where I'm a guide, is the one I'm most familiar with, and that essentially ran as a Soviet concentration camp for 5 years, and the justification of it was that everyone in there is a Nazi. You might think fair enough, but it's a good way to get rid of anybody you don't like, including 17-year-old werewolf actors and including members of the Social Democrats who were opposed to what was essentially a communist takeover of their party, using the name of the Social Democrats to give the communists credibility. At Special Camp 7, in the 5 years it was operated by the Soviets, it's estimated that 12,000 people died. According to the Soviets, they would have died of disease and starvation, thus neglect rather than murder. But let's look at the founding members of East Germany, view their kind of communist credentials, if you will. You've got people like Walter Ulbricht, Wilhelm Pieck, who had, Pieck was the president, Ulbricht was the leader of the party. The party actually has a lot more power. But they've spent the years of Nazi oppression outside of the country, over in Moscow, which itself was a pretty dangerous place. Stalin was incredibly paranoid. At some point in the mid-30s, he's like, well, all Germans are German, get rid of them. 3/4 of the German communists who had taken refuge in Moscow, they end up dead. But yeah, Albrecht and Pieck, they survive. Erich Mielke survives. Erich Mielke, who would become the head of the Stasi, he'd committed a murder in the early 1930s. He'd fled the country as a result of that. He'd fought in the Spanish Civil War in the International Brigade. He then fled to France, which, as the Nazis came to occupy France, he got out. He went over to Moscow. I'm not saying that these are all good people. I'm not saying that they're all bad people. It's really not about what my opinion on them is. What I'm trying to show you is that these people lived, breathed, and bled communism. Wilhelm Pieck, he was there in 1919 during the communist uprising just after the First World War, alongside Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, two figures who would very shortly be killed by proto-fascists who were then deified in the East German state. And it's these kind of people who want to present this narrative that the communists have come and saved them. We are communists, and therefore we are victims of the Nazis. The communists were the first victims of the Nazis, following the Reichstag fire and following the beginning of the concentration camps and these, extrajudicial arrests, torture, murder. But the narrative that they're creating also says, we're not guilty, we're not fascists, we're the anti-fascists. We got rid of the fascists in the special camps and in the war. Whereas so many Germans fled to the West, and guess what? The West were not exactly as tough on the fascists as here in the East. There's the famous denazification process over in the West, which is like a one-page questionnaire. You see people like concentration camp guards get, a slap on the wrist, a year or two in prison, something like this. You see a former Nazi become the head of the West German Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND. You can see that the East, on the one hand, they have a point, but it's also, we get into the Cold War, we get into the 1950s, and everything is amped up where both sides are hypocritical, and where both sides say, well, I'm right, and I'm the good guy, and they're wrong, and they're the bad guy. And this memorial was a kind of, I guess, a physical manifestation of this idea of we, the communists, are the victims, we only did the good stuff, those in the other side, they're the fascists, they're the bad guys. But again, this place isn't black and white. We absolutely should have a place to remember the Soviet soldiers. So many of them are so young as well. It's such a tragedy. We should have a place where they are honoured, where they are remembered. And I mean, I can't say that Britain, where I'm from, does things differently. It's not like we populate our monuments and memorials with the hard facts about the crimes of the British Empire or so. It's an odd place, a meaningful place, a powerful place, a beautiful place, a place that I certainly recommend that you visit. So how was this place used in East Germany? Communist countries loved a big old parade, lots of soldiers marching and tanks and things like that. And East Germany did do that, but the founding day of East Germany was the 7th of October. And this is about the Soviet Union. This is not about East Germany. This memorial existed before East Germany did. So this was rather more about specific Soviet anniversaries. So where they would have the big ceremonies here was, of course, on the 9th of May. This is because the surrender was signed just after 11 p.m. in Germany. So it's the 9th of May that marks what is called in Russia the end of the Great Patriotic War. And so, yeah, this is a place that I guess, if you were pro-regime, if you were communist, yeah, hugely important. A place where that victory, that liberation was celebrated, but not a place where East Germans would hold their hands up and talk about responsibility. And this, for me, is the big problem with how East Germany viewed history, and it's quite different to how the history is viewed in Germany today. But don't think that I'm painting a picture where, oh, well, they did everything perfectly in West Germany, because frankly, they didn't. It took a very long time in West Germany to talk about the potential guilt of the Second World War, and that was done by the generation that had grown up after it as well. And even then, it was in the mid-1980s when the German president started to call the 8th of May Liberation Day. And so it's really after German reunification where we reach a point of this kind of sadness and sorrow, yes, but this kind of upfront honesty, this view, we were the perpetrators, what we were doing was wrong. That's when that really starts to come together. So it's not really so much an East-West thing. And then that begs the question, what happens here then, after that reunification of Germany in 1990? Because this is something that, we tend to look back on, particularly internationally, and go, oh, that's a good thing. Within Germany, there are different opinions. Reunification wasn't necessarily a perfect process. I think you'd struggle to argue otherwise. But it also sent shockwaves through the world at the time because, you know, all change is a little bit scary. And anyone who was skeptical of a unified Germany had a lot of evidence on their side with the two world wars. And so, the Germans in 1990, around the time of unification, make a deal on neighborly conduct with Russia. And I say Russia because at this point, of course, everything starts to collapse. And once in the Soviet Union, and once the Russian Federation is formed, reunified Germany makes a deal with them where essentially they say they're going to look after all of their war graves, which I think is fair enough. I would expect the same of British war graves in various places. I know that American viewers will likely be familiar with the huge war graves out in Normandy next to the D-Day beaches, and you'd certainly expect that no matter the relations between the US and France, that those places are looked after. And that's how it is here. At the time of recording in 2025, German-Russian relations, at the very least, could be better. Let's leave it at that. Yeah, I digress. It's the federal German government that cuts the grass, tends the flowers, and polishes the gold letters, including the quotes from Stalin, which even the communists in the 1960s, you know, they said, oh, this Stalin guy, we should get rid of statues of him and rename streets that are named after him. Like, he wasn't an all-around good egg. But I guess because the quotes that I hear are, it's a very simple story. Honestly, it's simple enough for children to understand if you could read either Russian on this side or German on that side. And so, yeah, we have quotes from Stalin in gold lettering with his name that are still here. Yeah, the point of this video was to try to show you how a historical narrative around communism, the Soviet Union, World War II was created in East Germany, how Germany then deals with that in this place today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something. Actually, to talk about this place today, I mean, I talked about the Soviet Union and Russia a lot. Obviously, the Soviet Union was far more than Russia. It also included Ukraine. And on the 8th/9th of May these days, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the people who show up here obviously have kind of conflicting views, let's say. Just speaking anecdotally, before 2022, I'd say, okay, it's like Russian bikers, maybe the more pro-Russian Russians who tend to show up here on the 8th/9th of May. Once the war had kicked off, people from Ukraine and Russia started to show up. The police in Berlin said, there can be no Russian flags, there can be no Ukrainian flags, there can be no flags. Actually, you can bring flags. And it's a very quiet place. I've been here for a couple of hours filming all of my different shots and this piece to camera here. And it's super quiet. There's very little security. Actually, there's a little police car that drives around here and they weren't even bothered by me. But yeah, the police will be out here in force on the 8th and 9th of May. So yeah, it might be a bit of a weird vibe. But anyway, it's a place that's still a kind of living, breathing place today. I hope you liked the video. If you did, you should hit like and subscribe, because if you like it, you would like more of it. And if you do both of those things, I can make more of these things. I know you hear it from every single person on this platform. There is a reason for that. It is true. So, you know, don't be a douchebag. Do it. Okay, there should be another video on screen for you to have a look at now. I wonder what it is. Maybe it's one of mine. Either way, enjoy it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.